Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and I'm coming back to provide some clarification in response to a question that came up on the previous reparations video part 2. And the question/comment involved the issue of inclusion on a roll and exclusion. So let's quickly address that issue. Now, as previously indicated in the prior video, the cutoff cannot be based upon someone's arbitrary belief about who classifies as a Black person or who classifies as a pure descendant of enslaved people. The best way to create an inclusive role would be to include everyone who was either born prior to May 1st of 1968 or who is a direct descendant of someone who was born prior to May 1st of 1968. This cutoff cannot be based upon arbitrary determinations related to skin color. And this needs to be very clear. This is about descendants, and descendants aren't necessarily determined based upon someone else's determination of skin color or someone else's arbitrary determination of who they think should or should not be included. It's really an issue of legacy. So it doesn't matter whether or not someone wants to classify themselves as quote unquote pure Black or someone wants to classify themselves as mixed. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is inheritance, is legacy, is descendancy. And if you recall in the earlier video on standing, that is the issue. Does the individual have standing to even be placed on the roll? That is the only thing that matters. Now, down the line, when the issue of the types of restoration that might be possible, when that issue comes up later on, the issue of unclean hands is something that should be resolved. And so this is in addition to the date cutoff exclusion. What you're going to find, those of you who are going to be doing this research, is that there will be some people who are on that roll. They were in the United States, born prior to a particular date, but you will find that a number of the individuals who are descendants, they may turn out to be proven descendants of slave owners or slave traders, even though they might classify themselves as pure Black. You might want to start thinking about that ahead of time. There will be individuals on the roll who may have been descended from individuals who owned slaves as a part of the economy, and then you might have individuals who are descendants of those who owned slaves, where they were basically holding claim to family members to preclude them from being enslaved by someone else. And so there were some families that purchased family members out of non-family bondage. And there are some individuals who own slaves based upon unclean hands. These individuals would be descendants of those who were descended from African immigrants and European immigrants and Haitian immigrants. And so what you have is you have individuals who migrated from Africa freely. Not everyone who came over to the United States from Africa during the time of slavery came over as a slave. There were individuals who were Black, classified as black, classified as white, classified as mulatto, classified as Moor, that came over from Africa voluntarily to partake in what is now known as the American dream. Same thing with Europeans. You will find that there are people who are brown, who identify as African American, who came over to the United States, came over to the colonies from Europe. And those individuals may have been classified as black, white, mulatto, or Moor. They also migrated voluntarily to America to participate in the American dream. You have a third group, a third major group, which would be Haitians fleeing the Haitian Revolution, where they created a whole new caste system in Louisiana based upon skin color. And so many of those individuals did not come as enslaved individuals. Many came as free persons of color, as they were called. And so you've got these three major groups that, even though they fit the cutoff, you may find once you dig into the research, once people start to uncover things about their own heritage, that their ancestors had what we talked about in the previous video as unclean hands. Now, having unclean hands does not exclude someone from belonging to the ethnic group that's under that cutoff. It, however, may serve to either reduce the type of restoration necessary for that type of individual, or exclude them from restoration altogether because restoration is not needed. And the reason restoration may not be needed for certain groups is some groups came over as indentured servants initially. Some people that you classify as African American, Black Americans, they came over as indentured servants, or they came over, they were major landowners. They came over as settlers. They were major landowners, major business owners. They might have been included in what used to be known as the talented 10th. And so you do have a group of what you would consider Black nobility in the United States. They would be included in that talented 10th. And so when you look back at the history of those individuals, you'll find things like they had family members, they're descended from family members who were doctors and lawyers and educators and business owners from back in the 1800s. And so they were not all necessarily included in the roles of those who would be descended from actual slaves. And another thing to remember is in the United States, you do have three primary groups of people that you would classify as Black American, Negro, colored people that were in the United States prior to that May 1st, 1968 cutoff. And there are groups that came from Europe again, and then you have groups that came from Africa. Then you have groups that were already in the United States or already in America. And even among the ones that came from Europe, those were two groups. If you look at the documentation on the presence of Black or brown people in Europe, particularly in Britain, during the slave trade era, and I'm talking about the Barbary Coast slave trade and the Trans-Saharan slave trade and the transatlantic. If you look at the documentation, you'll see that there are two groups there also. So you had what Queen Elizabeth referred to as Negars and Moors. And so again, those are two groups. They may look similar, but those are not the same people. And as you recall, there was a group of Lancados. Those were cast out of Europe during that same time frame that spread out. They went to West Africa. They came over to the Americas. And so those individuals will be included in those roles. So in order to create an accurate role of individuals prior to the cutoff, inside of that role, you will have individuals who have more ties to Africa, might have even more genetic ties to Europe. They might have more genetic ties to the Caribbean because they came over to the United States during that era of slavery or during that time of Jim Crow. So to wrap this up, a role needs to be created first with the date cutoff. And then from there, much later down the line, this isn't even something that anyone needs to be concerned with at this point because you don't even have a role at this point. But later on, you can start to look at the issue of those who came from families where no one was ever enslaved. They were always property owners. They were always from the noble class or that talented 10th. You can start to look at the extent to which they endured minimal harm and the extent to which restoration may or may not be needed. And what's been happening also is that those individuals who've been speaking on the issue of reparations through the years, those individuals tended to be from that class that would be considered the talented 10th. So those educators, those doctors, those lawyers, and many of them talk about there being no need for restoration. And that part of that is coming from the fact that they are descended from people who have always experienced a level of privilege as it relates to Black Americans, Negroes, Indigenous Americans. And so they have often experienced this upward mobility. They have perhaps benefited from being slave owner descendants. And so therefore they may not have experienced the same level of harm. However, in order to create the role, everyone needs to be included in the role that fits under that umbrella ethnically and nationally, and those who are what you would consider admixed. And so you need to create that role first, and then you can start to delineate and think about who has experienced what types of harm and who needs what types of restoration. First, however, you just need to get a role started. And so that's something that, individuals can start working on, the questions for the role and how to get that together. You can start doing that relatively quickly. I would encourage people to focus on doing hard copy things. Everything does not need to be on the internet. I know that people are pretty internet dependent, but you want to have hard copies of things like that. And so you might want to start figuring out how to create the document and how to, compile that information from wherever you are located. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.